Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Especially Online with Dr. Nick. This is the latest in our special webinar series just for online members. My name is Shannon Lucky, and I am the Director of Communications and Outreach at Tops Club Incorporated, and I have the pleasure of being your moderator this evening for the session with Dr. Nick. Dr. Nick Yphantides, as you know, is a friend of Tops. He writes for our Tops News magazine, and he has his own very poignant weight loss story. So he knows what it's like to be on the other side of the obesity equation. Good evening, Dr. Nick.
Good evening, Shannon, and thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Well, we are so glad to have you here to answer member questions. So let's get right to it. The first question is from a member who says, I have been eating well and exercising regularly better than before in my life, and yet I am still stuck. What can I do to get unstuck?
Yeah, I can understand the feeling of doing all the right things but feeling like there isn't much progress. And, you know, I don't mean to sound like a doctor, but I have to be true to self. And I always tell people when they're about to embark on a weight loss journey and start a new program that the first thing that they have to do is have a baseline medical evaluation. That baseline medical evaluation will include a physical and also some blood tests, including your thyroid levels and other things to make sure that we're beginning at a healthy stage. There are some people who can have consequences and reasons for slower weight loss, but oftentimes it's a matter of quantifying that, evaluating it up front, and then doing an assessment of exactly what your starting point is, how many pounds it is that you have to lose, your age. All of these kinds of things can figure into the equation that will impact the speed with which you lose weight. But there are times where I've dealt with individuals who have sometimes unrealistic expectations, and progress is something that they expect to lose 5 to 10 pounds in a week or whatever, and anything short of that would be considered to be inadequate. So there are a lot of factors that play into it. But being true to myself as a doctor, I think it's very important at the initiation of a weight loss program to have a baseline physical exam, including some lab tests, just to make sure that all the underlying conditions in the body are good to go.
Our next question is regarding adrenal fatigue. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and why it may get in the way of our weight loss efforts?
First, let me talk a little bit about the adrenal glands. They sit on top of our kidneys, and they help modulate hormones like cortisol is probably the one that is best known. And cortisol is a stress hormone. And so there are people who, for example, when I was earlier in my career working in the intensive care unit, people would sometimes have massive illnesses, whether they were infections or serious pneumonia or the flu or aggressive forms of cancer. And because of the amount of stress that their body is going through, literally there can be something called adrenal insufficiency or adrenal failure or adrenal fatigue. I don't want to call it a controversy, but the question is whether or not adrenal fatigue and adrenal partial failure, if you would, can occur in the absence of massive medical illness, but in the presence of things like poor sleeping, dietary restrictions, stress that is out of control. So hopefully I've kind of contrasted the kind of true adrenal failure that happens with severe medical illness versus partial fatigue that can happen under stressful circumstances. There really isn't a medical, if you would, intervention. Really, it comes back to making a lifestyle adjustment. For individuals who perhaps have been under stress, obviously dealing with the underlying cause of stress. For individuals who are not sleeping, doing what they can to get more sleep. Physical activity as an alternative mechanism of, if you would, acting as a pressure relief. I do think that the controversy, if you would, exists that there are some who feel like we are too quick to blame the adrenal glands for our lack of energy. Our bodies can be very resilient, and again, considering the level of stress, I think it's possible. I have seen adrenal insufficiency that's real in people who've had major illnesses. For those who are experiencing what they consider to be adrenal fatigue, again, those lifestyle changes are really the only effective way of dealing with them. There's no, if you would, magic potion or pills or medication supplementation that can help in that situation.
We have a question from another member who suffers from fibromyalgia and is in constant pain. She says she's learned to deal with the pain, but the depression and anxiety that come along with that are harder for her.
Yeah, and this is a very, again, sensitive subject. And in answering some of these questions, I just want to make it clear to the TOPS members, too, that I have to, speak in generalities because I'm tempted to find out more information and ask more questions and so forth, because with something like fibromyalgia, there are a variety of strategies. And if you are accustomed and feeling like you can deal with the pain, but the anxiety and the emotional depression symptoms and so forth are what are causing the greatest challenge. And again, I have to be cautious here about making generalizations, but there's medical treatments available for that, in the sense of a variety of medications. And unfortunately, I'm not a behavioral health specialist. Just as a reminder to everybody on the call, I'm a family physician and a preventive medicine doctor, and so I'm what they jokingly say in medicine, a jack of all trades and a master of none. But in having treated many people with fibromyalgia, it really is a trial and error scenario where there are a variety of medications that are available for depression, for anxiety, and there's not a guarantee that they're going to work immediately. So there is a medical management, and some of it involves a bit of a trial and error type of an approach. With regard to the physical activity component, again, it's kind of a vicious, I would say, cycle a little bit, because when you're sore, you don't feel like you're going to be as capable to exert yourself. On the other hand, the physical inactivity actually makes the symptoms of fibromyalgia even worse. And what's true is that there are some types of exercises, especially the kinds of exercises that involve what's called resistance training, which basically, by the way, when you're lifting weights or using resistance machines or Nautilus equipment or bands or anything like that, you are stressing your muscles on purpose. And in stressing your muscles, what actually happens is you cause microscopic damage to your muscles. It really, that's the whole notion of resistance training, is pushing your muscles to the point of either exhaustion that almost causes a little bit of inflammatory damage to them. The process of muscle building and muscle toning occurs when your body, in trying to maintain its status and its sense of what we call homeostasis, of maintaining a balance for its capacity to live, doesn't like having those muscles stressed, so it lays down additional muscle tissues, and therein comes the capacity to then have bigger muscles, stronger muscles, better toned muscles, and that's what resistance training does. For individuals who have fibromyalgia, that kind of muscle, trauma, if you would, that happens could actually make some of the symptoms worse. And so until the fibromyalgia is under better control, as a result of both lifestyle, dietary, and medical interventions, the thing that I recommend folks do is more of the aerobic type activity. And the aerobic type activity that would be considered to be non-weight bearing. And the alternatives there, I think of three broad categories, are basically anything that you can do in water, Swimming is a tremendous and probably the best non-weight-bearing physical activity of all, but still provides your heart and your circulation and the stress benefits that we've already talked about. So any kind of water activity, whether they be water aerobics or just swimming or any kind of modified water type classes that are available in many local gyms and YMCAs, those are beneficial. Bicycle riding or stationary bicycle riding are also very beneficial. And then activities like yoga, and activities that involve stretching and muscle posture and what's called toning activities without necessarily the traumatic muscular influence of resistance training. That kind of physical activity can be beneficial as well. So in summary, with fibromyalgia, it really is very individualized. It's very much, I don't want to say trial and error, but there is a tremendous amount of effort that needs to go into trying different interventions to see which ones you respond to. And then in terms of the physical activity, doing physical activity that's more aerobic and non-weight bearing, swimming, stationary bicycles, regular bicycle riding, and yoga type activities as well.
Thank you, Dr. Nick. We're talking to Dr. Nick Yphantides here on our especially online chat. And just a friendly reminder that this is an informational webinar and nothing that you hear tonight from Dr. Nick should be construed as medical advice. And if you have a question about your own medical situation, you should certainly consult your own physician who's the most familiar with your situation. But getting back to the exercise question, Dr. Nick, would you recommend these same types of exercises, the swimming, yoga, bicycling, for other people with chronic conditions like arthritis, gout, or other things that might make it painful to do other types of exercise?
Excellent, excellent question, Shannon. And it reminds me to make a little bit of a distinction of the kinds of joint challenges that we have. Not to bring everybody to medical school, but there are different kinds of arthritis. And you mentioned, for example, gout, which is actually a metabolic situation which comes and goes with deposits of uric acid in joints, which causes pain. A lot of those kinds of arthritis can be controlled, again, with medical management. And so those are different. There's also inflammatory arthritis, like rheumatoid arthritis. For individuals who have struggled with their weight, the most common type of arthritis is what's called degenerative arthritis or osteoarthritis. And as hopefully the listeners today and TOPS members know, whether you've ever heard me speak or whether you read my articles that I write for TOPS News, I always keep it real, and I don't mean to inject myself, but I will say, having spent a vast majority of my adult life until 14 years ago as a morbidly obese man, the one residual, if you would, consequence that I have of my obesity is arthritis, especially arthritis in my knees, which is something that as I have aged and am the same year as the Super Bowl, so you can all figure out how old that is. The Super Bowl and I have a birthday this coming January. That, I'm more cognizant of it. And that kind of arthritis, the degenerative type of arthritis, is really discomfort that's happened as a result of extra wear and tear on the joints, the weight-bearing joints. The knees are the most common. Others have issues in their ankles, sometimes in hips as well, and perhaps even the lower back. That kind of arthritis is not as easily, if you would, treatable like gout or some of the others that, are really medically able to be modulated. And so for degenerative joint arthritis, there really is only medication that we can do to control the symptoms, and those include different kinds of pain medications. Tylenol is the most common, and then there's anti-inflammatory medications like ibuprofen and naproxen and the meds like Motrin and Aleve and so forth that are now oftentimes available over the counter. The best thing that can be done for degenerative arthritis is to unload extra weight. And so for individuals who are overweight and have arthritis, ultimately the best thing to do is to unload the excess weight. There is medication, again, and as Shannon mentioned, there's so many variables that go into choosing the meds based on your specific scenario that I'm not going to get into specific medication choices. But to finally answer your question, absolutely, non-weight-bearing activities. My favorite kind of activity when I'm not lifting weights in the gym currently is a stationary bicycle. And they even have the reclining now stationary bicycles where you're almost sitting in a chair with the pedals nearly in front of you. You put a football game on the screen for Dr. Nick and a stationary bike like that, and I can go for 60 to 90 minutes being distracted by my focus on the sporting event or whatever it is that somebody likes to watch. And so combining pleasure and benefit is something that I always promote. But absolutely, the non-weight-bearing activity for some, depending on where they live and the convenience of being able to get into a pool or a body of water, obviously seasonal realities affect that unless you live in Paradise, Hawaii. But, you know, even here in Southern California, even though it was like 90 degrees this weekend, our ocean is down into the 50s in terms of the temperature. So I haven't gone in the ocean probably for about 8 or 9 weeks. But, you know, swimming is also very beneficial. And so the same strategy as far as non-weight-bearing activity that we talked about for fibromyalgia, perfect to be used for the degenerative arthritis as well.
And that brings us to our next question from a member who has plantar fasciitis and has had a problem and had to put exercise in the back burner. And this member would like to know if there are stretches or exercises that would alleviate the pain and allow him to continue to his goal.
Yeah, and plantar fasciitis is a very, very tricky one because for folks who don't know, it's the ligament and the tendons basically that are right in the arch of the foot. And there is obviously, for most of us, the need to continue moving around and walking and doing our daily activities. And so, you know, unlike other parts of the body, when you hurt yourself, for example, you immobilize an arm or an extremity or whatever. With plantar fasciitis, you know, you still have to keep walking. With plantar fasciitis, there's a variety of strategies, including medication. Again, being a doctor, I've got to at least mention that you know, there are injections that are available that can really help healing. Professional athletes, amazingly, sometimes don't worry about the long-term impacts of their body, just the short-term. And as somebody who follows various professional sports, you know, you often hear of somebody who ended up getting a shot before the game that despite having their condition, it allowed them to play through the pain, if you would. Not something that would be typically recommended, because pain is actually a beneficial symptom in terms of a warning sign that allows us to experience healing. So there is, you know, injections available and so forth. There's also podiatrists and inserts and things that can provide support to the bottom of the arch, which can help facilitate healing. And then there are exercises where stretching your feet, and the best way to describe it is an exercise called dorsiflexion. But I think of like standing up against a curb where right under the base of your toes you have something that is pushing up against your feet, and then you lean forward so as to stretch, gently stretch the plantar fascia. That can be helpful as well. But again, doing that kind of stretching for somebody who's got acute fasciitis, meaning right in the midst of the symptoms, can actually be pretty painful. But as recovery happens, doing that kind of stretching where basically you're finding something to push against the bottom of your toes and then lifting your feet up so as to create that kind of a stretch along the bottom of your foot is known to be a beneficial exercise as well. We call that dorsiflexion.
Very good. We've also just heard from a member who wanted to reinforce what you were saying earlier about arthritis. He's 69 years old and was told that he needed to have both his knees replaced, which is when he joined TOPS. And now that he's lost 40 pounds, he can walk 5 miles in a day and is feeling much better. So we have many members report that weight loss really improves their quality of life.
Yeah, and it's really like so many things. And again, I speak at this, Shannon, from experience, you know, having been there, done that. I mean, prior to losing my weight back in 2001, I mean, without exaggeration, folks, I could barely make it up a single flight of steps. And it wasn't just aerobic capacity, it was because of the level of pain involved. After losing my weight and getting to my low weight of, you know, from nearly 500 pounds down to 197 pounds, I was able to hike Mount Whitney, you know, with ease, the tallest continental mountain in the United States. So that doesn't mean that the quote-unquote arthritis went away, but with less pressure on the joints and with less weight bearing, you know, the body was able to adjust, and the residual, if you would, leftover shock absorbers that are between the knees were adequate for the lower amount of weight. But when you were adding, I was adding extra weight, you know, if you would, the shock absorbers of my knees were being overwhelmed. And so the whole idea with degenerative arthritis, especially in the weight-bearing joints, is that you lose lubrication, you lose the cushion, but if there's less weight pressing on those things, amazing, it doesn't mean that your arthritis is gone or that your bones have healed or that you're all of a sudden making more lubricants. It's just the capacity of your joints and your bones to manage the weight is a lot easier, and so the pain goes away. The trick is, you know, if people have physical inactivity because of pain, it makes it therefore harder to lose weight. So, you know, somebody of that youthful age in their 60s who's able to lose 40 pounds and have that kind of dramatic symptomatic alleviation of pain is a wonderful testimonial, and it's what TOPS is all about, sharing those stories and sharing those real-life examples of encouragement.
So back to food. We have a member who has a question about when eating simple carbs, so we're talking about cookies, chips, sweets, that this person feels like they are getting hungrier and hungrier even though they're eating this. Is there something to that?
Fascinating. And by the way, Shannon, you're doing very good. You know, I feel like we could take this over the airways. I'm impressed with how you're modulating the questions. Well done. Yes, so as far as what we're talking about here is the refined carbs, and unfortunately there's a lot of supplemental carbs now that are added to junk food, like high fructose corn syrup and so forth. What ends up happening when those sugars, if you would, refined, purified, and you know, pure sugars hit the bloodstream, the body immediately tries to, quote unquote, put stuff into storage because it's extra fuel. It's probably more sugar than your body needs at that moment. I mean, ultimately, by the way, you know, food is fuel. That feeling that you have, which some don't have enough, of being truly physically hungry, when you get almost agitated and, you know, your body is grumbling and you're feeling lightheaded, and then you have something to eat and it's like a magic potion that alleviates things, well, that's when your body is craving fuel and your muscles need fuel. And I used that fancy word homeostasis before, but it's amazing how our bodies are designed to maintain that consistency of sugar levels and that consistency of fuel availability. Well, when you take in fuel in higher concentrations than you really needed, and there's an excess fuel circulating in the bloodstream, especially if it's refined sugars, the body has an organ called the pancreas, which sits up behind the liver and stomach and spleen, right in front of your kidneys in the back of your stomach cavity, and that pancreas starts pumping out insulin, and that insulin basically then tries to take that extra fuel, put it into storage. With time, as we put more and more into storage, obviously it gets converted into fat, and that's what ends up as extra fuel that we have, to go for the future. I always talk about obesity as almost having like a little car, whether it's a Mazda Miata or a Toyota Corolla or whatever, and you're basically pulling behind you a fuel tanker with extra fuel for the road. But if you keep putting more and more gas and fuel in your car than it needs, more and more of it's going to go into that storage bin, and we end up dragging more and more stored fuel with us. That's basically what obesity is. So when somebody takes refined sugars, though, to the point of the question, the insulin level gets pumped out, the blood sugar goes down, and then you've got that sense of low blood sugar again. And so there's this, again, vicious cycle of going from you ate too much sugar, your body compensated, put out extra insulin, that insulin puts the extra sugar into storage. With higher levels of insulin, there is low blood sugar, and all of a sudden some of those symptoms or cravings of hunger have come back again, and that vicious cycle of eating continues. Now, what's so complicated about losing weight and about healthy food behavior is that, this is just one component of the process. There's also the emotional component, and people eating even though they're not physically hungry, they're eating because they're emotionally hungry or spiritually hungry or relationally hungry. And I would remind the listeners, food is physical fuel. It does nothing to deal with those other appetites. And so when you combine the emotional eating components and you combine the influence of, processed sugars and high insulin and then low blood sugars, which lead to further food cravings, there's so many things involved, which is why when we eat what's called complex carbohydrates or foods that are less refined, that insulin spike doesn't happen because the carbohydrates, think of them as being slowly released into the bloodstream when you eat complex carbohydrates because they take a longer time to get digested and so forth in your body. That spike of insulin doesn't occur, and without the spike of insulin, then there isn't that kind of up and down sugar level, which can lead to some of the cravings that we were just talking about. So yes, complex carbohydrates and sugars are always preferable to refined ones.
Very good. We have another member who has a question. A lot of people are concerned about different things that are introduced into our food chain, and this member would like to know if it's possible that Americans are getting bigger because of enhancers that are fed to animals that we're eating.
Very good question. So, and I was just actually, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the TED Talks. I actually participated in a TED Med, which is a medical specific TED Talk last week. And this issue came up, and I was actually paying a lot of attention to it because I was pretty fascinated by it. The talk was on Thursday, which happened to be the same exact day, by the way. I don't know how many of you may have seen in the news about the first ever genetically modified salmon that was tested and approved for human consumption last Thursday, what was really fascinating about that and a little bit controversial with some pure food advocates is that because of the results of the medical testing and so forth, deeming the salmon to be totally safe, it's going to actually even be sold without special labeling to indicate that it's genetically modified. But, to the point of the question, the whole notion of the organic means by which we can raise either livestock or the organic means that exists with regard to farming is to basically try to keep the process natural versus, for example, with fruits and vegetables and produce and grains, adding mixes of fertilizers, which are, largely chemicals based on natural occurring things, but artificially prepared that helps plants grow faster and plants grow sturdier. And so oftentimes you'll see, the current modern farmed grapes, they're almost the size of golf balls. And then you look at the organic grapes, they're a lot more measly in comparison in terms of their size. Same thing is now happening in terms of mass production of meat. And it's been a common practice for a long time, whether it's, cows or swine or whatever, that there are hormones that are often used that will help, just like men and women who do competitive weightlifting or athletes who try to get an unfair advantage. You hear about the notion of anabolic steroids. Well, when you take anabolic steroids, it builds your muscle. When anabolic steroids are given to animals, it builds their muscle. And not to be grotesque, forgive me if there are vegetarians on the line, but that's the part of the animal that we consume in our steak. It's basically eating the muscle of a cow. And so by giving extra hormones, there can be stimulation in size. Now the question is, do those hormones have an effect on us, and do they account for us growing larger in size? And I took time on purpose to explain this so that hopefully by now maybe I've answered your own question. If it was going to increase size, the steroids would be increasing size of your muscles, not of your fat tissue. That's number one. Number two, in reality, by the time the hormones go into the animal, they have been, if you would, processed by the animal, and though there can be present in small detectable amounts in the meat that we eat, most medical experts, of which I am not one on this exact issue, but most medical experts on food don't consider their concentration to be high enough to be accounting for any impact in the human that is then consuming that meat. But again, think about it. If those hormones were there, they would probably be helping you look more like a professional athlete rather than helping you gain the circumference of your waist. And so there's a difference, obviously, with excess weight that comes with fat tissue versus muscle tissue. And so hopefully that gives you some things to think about. It's an excellent question, and one that as the world's population grows and we are looking for more and more innovative ways to prepare food and so forth, that I think is going to continue being debated and dealt with in the public front.
Well, it's hard to believe, Dr. Nick, but our time is almost up. I believe Carol is going over to the chat room to get ready for our 8 o'clock chat, but if we could just quickly get to one more question. For many years, water consumption was considered very important, and 8 was the magic number of 8-ounce glasses that someone needed to have. But it sounds like the research is a little different on that now. Can you shed a little bit of light on what we should be doing in terms of our water intake for weight loss?
Yeah, excellent. And I think I wrote something in my recess of my mind. I think I wrote an article about this over the course of the last year, or at least alluded to this. The 8 glass a day rule, I think, is for some people very unreasonable. Our bodies have become much more accustomed, and our bodies are more efficient than we realize in terms of even being able to get water out of the food that we eat and so forth. The one thing that I will say is that I think it is an excellent target, with rare exception, is it ever going to be counterproductive to drink, some extra water. Rarely does that, if you would, cause a problem. I would rather have people overhydrate than underhydrate. If 8 glasses of water a day seems unreasonable, it's not terrible for you to get by drinking 5 to 6 glasses of water a day, assuming that you're, having some dietary consumption of water as well. And frankly, the amount of water that we need to take is also dependent on how physically active you are, how much you sweat, the climate in which you live, and so forth. So I would say we are less dogmatic. It's a good goal to have, but people shouldn't panic if they can't quite get to the 8 glasses of water or take in 6 or 7 a day. That's probably fine too.
I'd like to just thank you so much for taking the time to be with us in our especially online chat series. I'm sure our members are very grateful to have your time and attention. And I'd just like to remind everyone listening that Dr. Nick's very good explanations this evening are for informational purposes only. Please do check with your own doctor before acting on any information that you may have heard this evening. Dr. Nick, thank you again so much for being here. We hope many of you will join us in the chat room following this for the regular Monday night meeting. Thank you, Dr. Nick.
Thank you, Shannon, and thanks to all the members who participated. I really appreciate it.